So this quote, which is in a handbook on shared values that we produced as part of the NEA, kind of summarizes a lot of what I'm going to be talking about in the next 50 minutes. That really, if valuations are going to be transformative, in other words, if they're really going to lead to improved sustainability, improved, more sustainable management of our ecosystems, they need to actually lead to our values being formed and changing at a social level. It's not just about eliciting our individual values, it's about transforming our values so that they are really recognized in decisions and so that it changes those decisions. And also it emphasizes that a lot of these values around the environment that we talk about, especially in the West, but from my own experience, although I won't be talking about that in this talk, also often in developing countries, these values around the environment are often implicit. And so they need this kind of shared social process, this kind of shared values approach to really bring them out. And as you will see later in this hour, that can actually change how people relate to their environment and also how they evaluate different policy options for it. So key questions, kind of when we relate this kind of shared values approach to sustainability transformation, is how can we more effectively integrate environmental values into decisions? How to build support for environmental conservation, and how should we address conflicts between environmental and other social aspirations? These are key questions that arise time and time and again in global agendas for managing the environment, from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment to Future Earth Now, and I think what we've been doing as part of the UK NEA and in the special issue can provide a little bit of a contribution towards developing some ideas on how taking a shared values approach and improving recognition of cultural and plural values of the environment can contribute to that. But these questions, we need to recognize, generate other questions, value-based questions in terms of outcomes and in terms of process. So in terms of outcomes, we need to consider, well, what outcomes are of the greatest social value? That's ultimately a key question. If we think about the principles of the ecosystem approach of the Convention on Biodiversity, one of the first ones is that how we manage the environment is a matter of societal choice. So if we think about what is a matter of societal choice, ultimately we can rephrase that as how do we manage the environment in such a way that it generates the greatest social value, except we might want to define that in a lot more broad way than previously has been done. But there's also questions that arise then in terms of process, and how should this be evaluated and by whom? What are the criteria for social value? Who should be included in that? And how do we go about it? So in terms of answering these kind of questions, usually implicitly and not explicitly, the ecosystem services agenda so far has really focused largely on ecological indicators and individual human values, analytically aggregated on the basis of what we call consequentialist assumptions. So consequentialist assumptions, many social scientists might understand what that means, but not everyone in this audience is. So I'm going to try throughout this talk and explain some of these terms. I hope I'm more or less clear with that. But consequentialism is one of the key approaches in ethics and the main ethical underpinning of mainstream economics, where something has value if overall it generates some kind of benefits. So basically, where it's all about the ends, it's about consequences, and are those consequences favourable, desirable, and preferred. So then, if we take those kind of consequentialist assumptions, management of ecosystem services can be perceived as trade-offs. We're basically trading off consequences against each other. And we might want to trade off the consequences to the losers versus the consequences to the winners. Are those beneficial consequences greater than those negative consequences? How does that stack up against each other? So economics typically uses analytical approaches to assess these kind of questions. And then policy can be informed by efficiency criteria, such as how do we maximize benefits versus cost, or how do we maximize the beneficial consequences versus the negative ones, and how do we minimize the negative consequences if we want to achieve a certain goal. But if we think about it, we think about this kind of approach mostly in terms of economics. It's well known, it's been criticized as being a rather narrow view, but then actually a lot of approaches that are not economic and that are sometimes posed as alternative ways of looking at ecosystem services and benefits to the environment, to human well-being, they actually take quite, if you look at them more rigorously at their assumptions, they take quite similar assumptions. So, for example, in public participation GIS, what we look at, if we try and kind of rate in some kind of numeric scale the degree to which something is perceived as a benefit in a particular place, we kind of aggregate them and generate, you often through some kind of hotspot analysis, so which places are particularly important for generating beneficial consequences to people in some sense. And then if there are management options that have negative and positive consequences, again, we use some kind of spatial analysis to see how we can kind of, what are the most efficient outcomes. So actually a very similar approach to mainstream economics. But what are the limitations of this approach? Are all our values really, can they all be coined in consequentialist terms? Probably not. And most philosophers would probably agree that they couldn't be. How do we aggregate values? So even if we have this assumption that values are in consequentialist terms, we might still kind of need to discuss, well, how do we weigh certain consequences against each other? And certainly when we expand that to a much broader sense of values that go beyond consequences, when we're talking about things like rights of people, how do we account for those rights? How do we then kind of aggregate that? It's becoming very complicated. How do the rights of individual members in a particular community who might be, say, expropriated from their house for a particular development, how can you aggregate those against a particular kind of amount of economic growth that might come from that development, or amount of benefits that might accrue to the developer? So these are really complicated questions, and economics itself kind of recognizes that it's limited in answering these. Can all choices be conceived of as trade-offs? In that example that I just gave, we're talking more about a conflict than a trade-off, really. It's a conflict between different categories that you can't really answer in terms of trade-offs, in terms of some kind of efficiency-based criterion. But more broadly, there are people who very strongly advocate this quite, often through economics, this consequentialist, individualist approach. And certainly economic analysis is still a kind of a key influencer and certainly a key justification in terms of when policies are put forward to people or within political processes. But as we've seen in various kind of cases, and within, for example, in the special issue, one of the papers discusses the Forestry Commission privatization example, where a large part of the forest estate a couple of years ago was being proposed by the English government to be sold off. And this led to massive social protests, bottom-up protests that they completely hadn't anticipated because of all of their kind of consequentialist analysis that actually supported the idea, thought it was quite an efficient solution. As you can see from that example and many others, that exclusion of the broader social and cultural values within this analysis, if they become dominant, can lead to or exacerbate conflict. But also, actually, despite that, economic analysis is often used as a means of justifying decisions. If we look at environmental valuations specifically, valuations of ecosystem services, they've actually not been particularly effective at influencing policy. So the reviews and meta-analyses that have taken place so far of looking at the uptake of ecosystem service valuation evidence into decision-making has indicated that the vast majority of studies has actually not influenced any kind of decision. So, why do we do it? We get some publications out of it, but we don't achieve that ultimate goal of a sustainability transformation. So how do we do it differently? So some challenges from this kind of idea of shared values as a bit of an introduction. So all through this talk, I'm really going to just be scraping the surface. So this is 15 papers that will be published in this issue, and obviously there's a huge amount of material in that. So I won't be able to cover it in any kind of depth. So I'll be running through a lot of things quite quickly and in a relatively shallow way to give you a bit of a flavor. And I'll be putting references at the bottom so you can see which particular papers you might want to read if you're interested in a particular aspect. But some of these kind of questions of are values preformed? You know, should values, can we just assume that people's values are preformed, or do they need some kind of process of value formation? Value plurality, are values really individual? Are values solely utilitarian? Aggregation issues, how to establish value to society? So to consider some of these big questions, the UK NEA kind of started to investigate that. In its initial phase from 2009 to 2011, there was a recognition of an important research gap. So basically this idea of shared values was put forward as the important shared meanings and shared identities and shared values that we have around the environment, and recognized as a very much underdeveloped theme. And so there was a substantial push to develop that research further in the second phase of the NEA, through a number of, which led to a number of technical reports, of which I led one. And this then eventually led to this ecosystem services special issue that I'll be talking about. So just to give you an overview of the papers, so out of the 15 papers, there's 6. The first 6 are theoretical largely. So we're talking about the general idea of shared values, how values are formed, how we can conceptualize cultural ecosystem services and what is their relationship to shared and cultural values. The aesthetic and spiritual values of ecosystems as a particular kind of category of values that are particularly hard to grasp through many methods used so far. And then looking at a much kind of larger scale, both in terms of spatial scale and temporal scale, at how shared values have evolved over time within our society in relation to the environment. And then a whole range of empirical papers looking at a wide variety of case studies, mostly across the UK. And so, when we look at this, I hope you can read this. Can you read this? Yeah, it looks okay on our screen anyway. A huge amount of different kind of methodological approaches and methodologies that have been used in these case studies. So if we look at the first 4 here, I'm not going to go into the frameworks column, but we've been using analytical deliberative methods, interpretive methods, we call interpretive deliberative methods, linking elements of interpretation and deliberation, psychometric methods, psychometric aspects linked to deliberative methods, other types of deliberative methods, and then instrumental methods. So a huge amount of different methodological development that we've been doing as part of this work. So involving things like storytelling, participatory mapping, walking discussions, visioning, what we call deliberative monetary valuation, so combining some kind of form of economic valuation with deliberation, conceptual systems modeling, and here's the other papers there, arts-led dialogue, community voice methodology, ethnographic video interviews, qualitative multi-criteria analysis, in-depth discussion groups, questionnaires, walking discussions, etc. So a huge array of different methods that we've been using. And then a final paper which provides some kind of synthesis and future directions for research. So some definitions to start with. So what do we mean by shared values? It's a very fuzzy term, but we've kind of come to the conclusion that when we talk about shared values, we mean the values we hold in common as communities, cultures, societies, formed through a long-term process of socialization or over a shorter period of time through shared social and deliberative processes. And then what are cultural values? We could say that they're shared values at the level of cultures. Plural values are values is more of a term that recognizes that values are plural in 2 senses. That they might be called axiologically plural, which means that they reflect incommensurable ethics and aesthetics. So that example, for example, of rights versus benefits that I was talking about previously. But you can also look at aesthetic values as separate categories of values, which need to be taken into account somehow. And values are also ontologically plural in terms of that when we're thinking about concepts of value, really there's 3 different concepts that we might be talking about. What we call transcendental values, principles of life goals that transcend specific situations. So very broad array of them. So things like kind of things that we all probably like and would like to encourage: protecting the environment, a world of beauty, wisdom, loyalty, for true friendship, etc. But also values that have to do with self-enhancement, wealth, achievement, being successful, influential. And then there's another axis of openness and tradition. So some of the social scientists will probably recognize this schematic as a set of values developed by Schwartz and colleagues. So a broad set of transcendental values that really influences how we evaluate situations, but that transcend specific contexts. And we can distinguish those then from contextual values, so specific opinions that we have on the importance of worth within a particular context, and value indicators, which are measures of that worth, so such as amounts of money, but they could also be rankings or scores or counts or any kind of indicator that we could use for measures of importance. And then in one of the papers we did an extensive review on within the deliberative and participatory literature what's really meant by deliberation. And this is the detailed definition that we came up with. So crucial there is that when we talk about deliberation, it's a social process, it's a learning process, and it's an evaluation, potentially an evaluation process. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about cross-cutting themes across the issue. So 5 different themes, and after that I'll give you some examples of the empirical papers before I come to some conclusions. So cross-cutting themes are the formation of shared values, role of transcendental values, deliberation as a means of value aggregation. Deliberation has really been quite a central aspect in this special issue, and in general is kind of a linchpin within the idea of shared values and shared values approaches. So we're also looking at understandings and critiques of deliberation, bringing out some self-critique there, and then interrelations between our sense of values and when we're talking about place, identity, and interpretation. So kind of linking this kind of debate around shared values to questions of cultural values in particular and cultural ecosystem services. So starting with this first theme, so we can talk about shared values as values that are formed through shared understandings and shared social processes. And a crucial assumption here, or a crucial conclusion here, that Irvine et al. Came to in this issue is that it cannot be assumed that shared values exist a priori, and that valuation should not ultimately be considered as a process of value elicitation, but value formation and expression. So we might need to start changing our language around values. So typically in the ecosystem services literature, we're talking about things like measuring and capturing values. We might need to shift that more towards expressing values and forming values. And this kind of formation process can take place at different spatio-temporal scales, from one-shot workshops to large national scales public deliberations. So another paper in the issue, Kenter, Reed and Fazy, the deliberative value formation model, came up with a model which is not surprisingly titled the deliberative valuation model. And here we conceptualize in detail based on a number of social psychological theories, the theory of planned behavior, the value beliefs norms theory, and the value change model, as well as our own experience as facilitators. So Johan Fazy, Mark Reed, and myself, we've each had a lot of experience in facilitating group workshops and facilitating valuation processes. And so that combined experience from practice, as well as those theoretical theories, have given us a sense of how we kind of can come up with a more rigorous theoretical model of how such a deliberative value formation process could work. And the way we see it is that it's ultimately a process of translation of transcendental values from a social scale to that kind of individual realization within a group that then leads to a contemplation of how do we apply these transcendental values to our sets of beliefs, to our perceptions of the situation. How does that then involve our normative concepts? And that can be in a very broad sense, so that can in any kind of ethical underpinning, and how does that then kind of inform our contextual values, so our opinions of worth or importance of particular things that we might be valuing, and of particular policy options, management options in relation to the environment, etc. And then ultimately, within that value formation process, that could be expressed as a set of value indicators. So within that process, there's a lot of ingredients that you can see there. There's a range of key factors of influence, and it leads to a range of potential outcomes. So changes in aesthetic understanding, changes in trust, changes in capacity to deliberate. So all these things that are generally seen as desirable. Other things that, depending on where you're coming from, might be seen as desirable or undesirable, and other things that are probably generally seen as undesirable, so things like social desirability bias. So we discuss in this paper how we can manage these processes and manage these key factors of influence to try and mitigate these negative factors and ensure that the positive ones come out, as well as ensure that there is a rigorous process for value formation. So, a paper by Everard, Reed, and Kenter looks at a much larger scale over in a history over time of how these kind of values are formed within societies at a societal level. And so we have a conception of what we call a ripple effect, that if we look at how what we call the ethical envelope is expanded over time to be more and more inclusive of different aspects of the environment, at least this is written up in a Western context, and how that then gets institutionalized. Again, we kind of emphasize the process of social learning, and we recognize a theme that ultimately environmental values only get institutionalized, so through things like laws, through policy, through practice, through protocols, through changes in social norms, if it crosses interests. So they might arise in a particular set of interests with individuals, peer-to-peer networking, single-issue concerns that can come out into the media, etc. But crucial there in the middle are these cross-sector connections. And then this can lead to levers that have to do with kind of social, technological, environmental, political, legal aspects that can then lead to institutionalization. So we describe that kind of process, and it's a hopeful paper. You know, despite all the kind of misery in terms of our environment, we can see that there are processes that can be harnessed for value formation in a positive way to generate pro-environmental values. But in all of this, in all these papers, and this is Raymond and Kenter highlights, transcendental values are an essential ingredient. But they've been largely ignored by the ecosystem services literature so far, and this is in part to do with there's actually quite an active disinterest in neoclassical economics. So if we look at mainstream economics, which is neoclassical economics, as I kind of said before, we have these consequentialist assumptions. So it's all about kind of the outcomes. There's not really an interest in what kind of underlies the outcomes, and those outcomes, whether they're desirable or not, are conceived of as desirable when they meet people's preferences, when they satisfy people's preferences. But what people's preferences are based upon, so you could say preferences are kind of similar to this notion of contextual values. But what these preferences are based upon is really not questioned. There's no interest in that. Because there's this kind of conception of, well, it's actually the most democratic thing to treat everyone's preferences equally, despite that some of them might be quite, undesirable. So, which then kind of gives to that kind of issue of, say, that if we're looking at that European Statistics Agency, when we look at economic indicators, for example, for economic growth, what's counted in that includes kind of economic growth caused by ill health. Economic growth is in terms of crime, prostitution, etc. Because all of these things are seen as preferences that are being satisfied. So within a perfectly economic neoclassical conception, all of these things are actually things that somehow satisfy our welfare because there's someone willing to pay for it. So if someone's willing to pay for it, it must satisfy their preferences anyway. So this explains this active disinterest in neoclassical economics based on this kind of pseudo-democratic principle, but it's a very narrow way of looking at, and a very consumerist way of looking at democracy that certainly I wouldn't share. And it also negates the empirical literature that says that when we actually ask people about their values, including in an economic sense in terms of their individual willingness to pay, what might underpin that willingness to pay for different things includes all this much broader set of ethical, aesthetic and political motivations. Now, often these kind of transcendental values that these motivations might be linked to are implicit. They don't often come out explicitly. We don't necessarily think of our deeper held values in the environment, or even our deeper held values in a social sense, until we really get into it. We don't quickly think of all the depth of our experience and our values and how that relates to our identity or questions like that if we fill in a 15-minute online survey usually. But these values do come to the fore when we talk about catalyst or conflict points, like that example that I gave about the forestry sell-off. Or they can be brought out through active prompting, so in a facilitated valuation process, for example. But which transcendental values are activated depends on how the valuation is framed and institutionalized. And as I said, there appears to be potential for deliberative valuations, and we're finding some empirical evidence in this issue that transcendental values can actually change through these kind of deliberations. Now, all of this has epistemological implications, namely that contextual values cannot be positively known by a neutral observer because the way that valuation is conducted influences the values elicited. So this kind of neutral analytical approach that's proposed usually by mainstream economics is not really realistic, because what you get out partially depends on what you put in. So this is kind of the quantum physics of valuation, so to speak. And yeah, so like I said, this actually challenges common approaches in economics. And it also comes out then that value aggregation becomes a normative process. And we need to establish the weights between different dimensions of values, things like those rights, benefits, etc. And also within them. So how do individual counts within that? So whose rights count more than others? Whose benefits count more than others? Is there, should they count the same? How should they be counted? There's no kind of straightforward answer to that. So this requires then a set of meta-values. So how do we then actually decide on who should count how much and what kind of dimensions of value count how much? So that's why we call it meta-values. We need values around how we add up our values. So we need deliberation for that. That's kind of becoming increasingly clear. We can't just have some kind of analytical approach and use surveys, etc. We need deliberative approaches to bring people together to discuss these things. But then we need some critical reflection on what deliberation is. So Irv and I talk about deliberation being an end in itself as a catalyst for new democratic spaces. So it's not just a means to get at kind of deliberative values, but in itself it can be a democratic space for people to participate in decision making. But then, what constitutes a valid, legitimate democratic space is a big question. So Orchard Webb et al., and I'll show you an example of that study, hopefully, if I have enough time, comes to conclusions that we can really do our best to design these spaces in as perfect a way as possible through process design, through facilitation, through spending lots of attention on inclusivity and other kinds of key aspects, those key factors of influence that came out in that deliberative value formation model. But ultimately, deliberative democracy and something which is called communicative rationality, which is a way of kind of legitimizing what arguments count within and how we should communicate and decide about that, and how that can translate into action, which is seen as often an underpinning of philosophical underpinning of deliberative democracy. These are ideals that we can aim for, but we can only approximate. So it's important to recognize that we can never achieve this kind of perfect democracy. That we're always going to fail, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. But Edwards et al., they go further, and they say, well, actually, some of these underpinnings, these philosophical underpinnings of deliberative democracy, and also the way that people often conceive of these situations in practice, are mistaken. And actually, the way that deliberation is phrased within deliberative democracy and these more conventionally instrumental approaches, it's actually often quite similar how they conceive of decision making. Decisions are seen as concrete moments in time that can be influenced. So it's basically we have a particular moment, we need to kind of generate some kind of evaluation that then evaluates that particular decision-making moment, and fits into that. And that really negates a whole kind of institutional level that we forget about. And so they advocate we need a cultural historic perspective on decisions and integrate that into deliberation. So deliberation should be a much longer process where people get confronted with those institutions and that history, and not just focus on a particular decision-making moment. And so they develop an approach called arts-led deliberation, which achieves that by having the artists kind of bring out and provoke people into thinking about how these kind of cultural and historical aspects kind of link to the institutions that are around that particular question of environmental management. So another kind of thing that then gets highlighted within all of this is what should be the role of the facilitator? Should it be to encourage people to lead to social learning, emancipation, or should they still be more neutral? How can you be neutral when you're kind of trying to get people to learn? Because aren't you then kind of manipulating people? Where do you draw the line? So I think that's kind of a live debate, an ongoing debate, and we need to kind of develop that kind of question further and pay attention to that tension. So kind of when we're starting to talk about these kind of cultural and historic aspects, and the need for interpretation of institutions and interpretation of the context, that then leads us to the fifth theme and final theme, interrelation between shared, plural, cultural values and place, identity and interpretation. We are talking about the environment here, although much of what I've said before can be applied to many other kinds of contexts, health, social care, any kind of something that involves public goods, potential conflicts between different interests, etc. Here I'm focusing on ecosystems, on landscapes, on place. And many ecosystem service valuation approaches, whether they're deliberative or not, so again this kind of is a bit of a critique of deliberation, tend to assess abstract and generalized senses of ecosystem services, or benefits, costs. We tend to look at maps and abstract forms. We sit together with people in workshops, quite abstracted from the actual environment itself. And really, again, this limits the type of values that we can include. When we talk about idiosyncratic values, place-based values that really come out when people are in those places. How do we recognize this? How do we recognize that those relational values, the two-way nature of these ecosystem services? And that requires then more integration of identity and relationality into these more kind of shared values, deliberative approaches, by linking them with interpretive methods, which have been, which have actually focused on these issues much more than the deliberative democracy literature. So just to kind of quickly highlight, as part of this issue also, Rob Fish and his colleagues developed a new framework for cultural ecosystem services that kind of looks at services in this relational way where they're an interaction between kind of shared cultural values, spaces, so the biophysical environment, people's practices, and this then leads to benefits for, in terms of identities, things like belonging, sense of place, experiences such as tranquility, capabilities such as knowledge, health, etc. Now these are kind of some profound shifts in the way that we conceive of cultural services, away from that kind of more linear thing of environment creates service, creates benefits, to a much more kind of relational, circular, interactive thing where there's an interaction between spaces and practices, which then generates a sense of place for people that gives rise to these kind of benefits in a very pluralistic way. And so we've applied these frameworks and some of these kind of conceptualizations in a number of examples that I'll be giving. So starting off with a really big one, part of the UK NEA follow-on UK marine cultural ecosystem services. So there was kind of 5 papers of the issue that feed into this single case study, 2 theoretical ones at the top and then 3 empirical ones at the bottom, because we used quite an extensive combination of different methods. So I'm not going to cover that all in detail. As many of you know, many kind of MPAs have been proposed over the past years, and some of them designated. We adapted this cultural ecosystem services framework to a marine context. So it was Ross Bryce at PERF, a UHI that I was collaborating with, as well as others in developing this study, and particularly here in that Bryce et al. Paper, and focusing on translating those capacities, identities, and experiences into a set of subjective well-being indicators. Things like, these sites feel almost like a part of me. I've had a lot of memorable experiences in these sites. And we had a very large-scale survey. There was almost 1,700 participants, divers and sea anglers, right across the UK, talking about places in their vicinity and how that affected their subjective well-being in terms of the degree to which they agreed with these different statements. So their statements were then, through factor analysis, came to 6 dimensions of well-being, including engagement and interaction with nature, place identity, therapeutic values, spiritual values, transformative value in the sense of the way that sites and experiences and memories can transform people's lives, and social bonding. So you can see again, the much more kind of the more plural, relational way that we're looking at the environment here than in a conventional economic valuation of ecosystem services. But still, we were able to do this at a large scale, and we looked at 151 MPAs to see what their relative scores were on those indicators. And this then fed into decision making on how these MPAs, which MPAs could be designated. So this is just a selection of ones there. But also then Ross did a secondary analysis on whether those well-being indicators, and this was just the mean of them, were in any way defined or influenced by biophysical features. So bringing it back to the ecosystems themselves. So we looked at things like number of species of conservation importance, birds, other kind of charismatic species, large fish, etc., sets of habitats. And the interesting thing is that actually what seemed to appear to influence people's subjective well-being most was this measure of biodiversity. And most of these species of conservation importance, there were 40, which was the kind of motivation or partial motivation for these MPAs to be designated, were really quite invisible and not charismatic. And nonetheless, they really somehow influence people's scores on these well-being indicators. So Kenter et al., in my own study, we looked at monetary evaluation and then linked that to those subjective well-being indicators. We had a number of phases. We had this online survey that we started off with. So conventional economic valuation, asking people in a survey how much they're willing to pay for different kinds of benefits, etc. And then in phase 2, we had a deliberative monetary evaluation workshops. 130 people participating across a number of workshops across the UK, with a number of stages where we looked at their individual willingness to pay, but also had groups deliberating together on what they thought would be a fair price for divers and anglers. These were all divers and sea anglers, would be willing to pay to protect marine sites. And we had 2 what we call deliberative interventions, one that was focused on information, the other which was focused on transcendental values. And we brought that out through doing a values compass, which I'll show you with the next example, and storytelling. And then we looked at the effect of those interventions as well as the effect of doing it in a group way versus doing it in an individual way. So a complicated design. So just kind of starting off with the results from the storytelling. So if you would want to guess where this was, where this quote came from, like physically where this diver was when he was talking about this was in the Clyde, not very far from Glasgow. So it's quite remarkable that, even in the most kind of environments that we wouldn't kind of think of as special, they can be. So many kind of broad themes that related to these kind of identity questions, questions of place, and questions relating to transcendental values as well that came out in this storytelling exercise. And in the monetary evaluation, we considered people's monetary values for protecting different types of marine landscapes, underwater objects, different kind of charismatic species, as well as, again, the kind of species under endangered species, so more kind of non-charismatic species, and restrictions and access options, as well as kind of size and travel distance. And what we found then, in terms of any potential differences between the individual and deliberated, non-deliberated, and deliberated values and individual and group values, was that remarkably people's monetary values actually went down throughout the process. So deliberation meant that they were less willing to pay to protect the environment, and doing it as a group meant they were even less willing to pay. But actually, this is but I'll show you some. I'll explain that in a minute. But why? But there were some other effects that we can use to explain that. People had much more kind of scrutiny around sites. They had clearer preferences. So these are just sort of part of the statistical model, but it demonstrates that people had that previously where they had no non-specific preferences around different habitats, and now habitats influenced which sites they were willing to protect more than others. There were differences between people more closely looked at restrictions on dredging and trawling, so they were less willing to pay for places that had less restrictions. They were concerned about access options. They were less willing to pay for large fish, so they were less influenced by these kind of more basic questions of are we going to get have some big fish that we can see or that we can fish on, and more about kind of biodiversity and things like that. And there was, interestingly, in the group scores, convergence between the subjective well-being scores as well as the monetary values. So interestingly, those non-monetary values were actually better reflected in the group valuation than in the individual ones. So the reasons why people's monetary values went down is they were much more scrutinizing everything. They started to recognize there were competing social priorities. They recognized there were also other environmental projects. They considered the effectiveness of particular proposals. So, for example, which restrictions were put in place, etc. And there were questions on fairness and responsibility. So questions around who has access to a site, who should be paying, etc. So what you could see is that people's values, although they went down, in some sense they were much better formed, and they were probably more realistic. And this is a bit of an issue with conventional economic approaches, that often there's an overestimate when we survey people for their willingness to pay. So participants also felt more confident during the workshops, and they had a strong preference for using the group workshop outcomes rather than individual ones in decision making. So I'll briefly go through other case studies. So another example by Orchard Webb et al. Is looking at the future of Hastings, the largest beach launch fleet in the UK. We were looking at strategic sustainable development. So this was a very much, this was called a DDMV, a deliberative democratic monetary valuation. So rather than being based on some kind of statistical modeling of people's individual values or group values even, values were directly negotiated here between people on the basis of kind of deliberative democratic principles. So people started off with what we call a values compass. They looked at all those transcendental values and considered how important they were. They then came to, through a range of other exercises, they also did some storytelling. They went onto the beach and had discussions had beach walks and kind of discussions in situ. They watched some videos of what was happening in the local environment. And this was a very broad group of fishermen, kind of students, people from the local council, people from the local fisheries conservation authority, and a whole range of other people from Angling Club, Residents Association. So a very broad range of stakeholders that wouldn't normally talk to each other, but a small group, only 11 people. They came up collectively with a set of goals, environmental, economic, cultural. They evaluated this in a kind of multi-criteria context. so looking at how these different goals could be achieved by different visions that were through a visioning exercise. And then eventually they negotiated willingness to pay between them out of a fund that they could afford that from. So there was, I think, 45 million or something that they could allocate to different options for sustainable development of Hastings in relation to that marine environment. So really an emphasis here on synergies and finding options that met multiple goals, like, for example, in terms of eco-housing, environmental goals, mitigating climate change, but also achieving social goals and providing employment. It's another case study by Ranger et al. Starting off with videos, interviews using a community voice approach, a set of ethnographic videos starting off with transcendental values, looking ultimately more at the management of the particular sites. Clips that best express different views were collected and compiled into a 30-minute documentary for a number of different marine protected areas that were being considered. So we looked here specifically at the management of a smaller number of marine protected areas and how actually bylaws should be put in place by the inshore fisheries and conservation authority. So this was directly working with decision makers to try and work out how values could influence decisions. So a whole range of, don't have that much time here, but we looked at things like economic questions, long-term sustainability, impacts on recreational activities, conservation objectives in those workshops. And people then try to negotiate, but ultimately vote on which management scenarios they would they thought should be put forward. And people generally felt this was very had quite strongly positive reflections on the process in terms of learning, in terms of bridge building with others, etc., and in terms of influencing the process. So if we look then to kind of, I'm coming to the end here, at these studies, what can we learn from the process and outcomes? Well, that these initial exercises that we were doing, things like those value compasses, storytelling, ethnographic video, beach discussions, it brought in those kind of broader shared transcendental values, shared identities, shared sense of place, relational values with the environment. And that supported a common sense of purpose, enabling bridging between many different types of interests that would otherwise conflict. So, for example, in that Ranger et al. Study, fisheries and conservation interests, who would usually find it very hard to find alignment, found out they were actually having quite a lot of shared transcendental values and a shared sense of place in terms of the places that they would visit. This then led to more of a focus on synergies, more of a sense of wanting to negotiate and come to agreement. So in the Hastings example by Orchard Webb et al., they came to consensus. In the Ranger example, there was an agreement to disagree, but at the same time, people were more still accepting of that process, which was felt to be seen as legitimate by participants. But when we look at these things, again, the practice indicates that we achieved a really quite high level of democratic deliberation, but still in terms of bringing in participants, who's participating, and informal power relationships between people, for example, their professional status, it's very hard to fully kind of level that out. So, kind of summarizing then what would be a shared values approach, what are the key kind of lessons of how we move forward with kind of approaches. The key is recognition of this ontological and axiological plurality of values, and the recognition that these plural values need to be deliberated. This needs to be considered within a recognition of institutional factors, role of power, for example, in process of value elicitation formation, and the need to recognize and interpret cultural and institutional histories placed in any experience to really understand values in that context and within that process. The inevitable subjectivity of all valuations that arise from, but particularly that arise from complexity and contestedness of many environmental issues, and so that there are limits to any valuation. But at the same time, that these kind of deliberative valuations can act as transformative democratic spaces, boundary objects that bridge the divide between research and practice. So if you look, for example, at that Ranger et al. Example, the Fisheries Authority is about to announce a set of bylaws that very much reflect what came out of those workshops. So there's a direct influence that we can show there, a direct impact of this research. I'm not going to talk much about future directions. The final paper in the issue has about 35 different key research questions, things on what I've talked on many of these things already, and there's kind of many more areas, so it's a recommended read. So thank you for listening.